Good afternoon. Welcome to Portland State's Friday Transportation Seminar. I'm Chris Monsieur. I'm a faculty member in Civil and Environmental Engineering, and I'm a co-faculty host along with Professor Jennifer Dill in Urban Studies and Planning. Our Friday transportation seminars have been a tradition since 2000. These seminars are usually held live on the PSU campus, in addition to being broadcast, but due to the pandemic, today's seminar is fully online. This fall, the Friday Transportation Seminar lineup is focused on equity in transportation, recent research and practice. Today, we're very pleased to have Margot Hill present on tribal mobility, accessibility, and social equity. Margot Hill is a Spokane tribal member and serves as the Associate Director of Small, Urban, Rural, and Tribal Center on Mobility. She served as a Spokane tribal attorney for 10 years and as a Coeur d'Alene tribal court judge. She's a faculty member at Eastern Oregon University. Before jumping into her seminar,
Eastern Washington. Sorry, I had to correct you, Chris.
Did I say Eastern Oregon? I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Eastern Washington. See, I didn't do as good, Jennifer. Before jumping into the seminar, I'd like to let you know a little bit about next week's seminar. We will have Professor T.R. Bills from Wayne State University, case studies of travel demand analysis in transport disadvantaged communities. The week after that, we will have Charlene McGee from Multnomah County talking about at the intersection of safety, race, and transportation. Just a quick overview of the seminar. We'll be recording today's seminar, and the slides will be posted online, and afterwards a link will go out to all attendees. The webinar has been approved for 1 CM or PDH hours through AICP. And you can expect the presentation to be about 40 to 45 minutes with about 15 minutes for questions. If you want, the questions will be taken by typing. So if you type your questions in the question pane on your control panel, we will present them to Margot at the end of the seminar. So with that, I will turn it over to Dr. Hill.
Can you see my screen?
Yes.
And can you hear me? Good, okay.
Great. Great.
Eo putis in Kasihu, putis in Quelli, putis lichalacht, Louis Quest, Margot Hill. Hello and good day. My name is Margot Hill, and I will be visiting with you about tribal mobility, accessibility, and social equity. I earned my Juris Doctorate from Gonzaga School of Law and my bachelor's in political science at the University of Washington. I also have a master's in urban regional planning that I got right here at Eastern Washington University. We have a CIRCOM, a small urban rural tribal center on mobility, and I'm going to be sharing with you a little bit about the work we do at Eastern Washington. As was mentioned, I served as my tribe's attorney for 10 plus years, and I also served as a tribal court judge for the Coeur d'Alene tribe of Idaho. It's with a warm heart that I visit with you today, and I want to mention that my great uncle, Herman Boyd, attended Portland State University in the 1920s. It was very rare for American Indians to go to college at that point in time, but he grew up on the reservation and went to Wappinet High School, and a teacher helped him get a football scholarship to Portland State University. They call him Wahoo Boyd, and he was, after graduating from Portland State University, he went to officer candidate school. He became a fighter pilot. He was at the bombing of Pearl Harbor and lived to tell that story. Unfortunately, Herman Boyd was killed in a night flying mission. He was one of the highest ranking American Indians in all the United Forces. And he's alumni of your university. So it's a great honor for me to visit with you today. I'm going to talk to you about tribal transportation, mobility, social equity, accessibility. At Eastern Washington University, we have a history of working with tribes across the Pacific Northwest. We do a lot of applied research, and one of the organizations that we primarily work with is the Affiliated Tribes of Northwest Indians. ATNI represents 57 tribes in Washington, Oregon, Idaho, and Northern California. As you can see from this map, there are a large number of American Indian nations in your region and across the Pacific Northwest. So I encourage you to take this opportunity to work with tribes and help tribes to solve some of their transportation and mobility challenges. That's what we do at Eastern Washington. We do research that will help our tribal communities. It's really important to understand just a little bit about tribal sovereignty, about federal preemption. You cannot do good transportation planning in Indian country without understanding a little bit of American history and a little bit of federal Indian law. So I'm going to just give you a touch of that, just to make sure we're starting with the same foundation. Understanding tribal sovereignty, it's very complex and complicated, but it's very relevant to transportation planning, and it helps you to understand the mobility challenges of tribal communities, the accessibility challenges of tribal communities. I spend entire months on these subjects. I teach federal Indian law. I teach a whole range of different classes, and so I'm going to just give you a little bit of background, so you as the civil engineer, as the environmental planner, as the transportation planner can have a little bit of understanding. So federal Indian law really, it comes from international law when we think about treaties. And again, I'm just going to whip through these just to give you a little bit of a background. Tribes have inherent tribal sovereignty. That means they have the right or power to govern themselves. They had this right prior to European contact, and so we call it inherent. They were sovereign by nature and necessity. They conducted their own affairs. They depended on no outside source of power to legitimize their acts of governments. The United States entered into over 369 treaties with with different American Indian tribes across the nation. There are federal statutes that augment, make greater this power of tribes. Congress specifically has enacted a lot of these laws that apply to Indians. Some are specialized just for Indians, Indian Child Welfare Act or Indian Gaming Regulatory Act. Others are statutes of general applicability. Not all tribes are treaty tribes. Some tribes are executive order tribes. And then, of course, there are federal courts decisions that are made in federal courts up to the United States Supreme Court across this country that determine what is federal Indian law. There's administrative regulations, but of course, a primary law is the United States Constitution. Tribal governments and tribal sovereignty is recognized in the Indian Commerce Clause. We have the Treaty Clause, the Supremacy Clause. Tribal folks are subject to federal laws, and it's this federal preemption that preempts state laws from applying in Indian country. There are some exceptions. We won't get into those deep dive details today, but just understanding that it's federal Indian law that we're talking about when we're talking about Indian country. And then, of course, each tribe has its own constitution, law and order code. They pass their own statutes or resolutions. Those are the internal laws that apply to their tribe and their tribal members. That's how they conduct their own affairs in Indian country. Some tribes have very evolved traditional property law, like the Tlinkits out of Alaska. To give you a perspective, a visual perspective, on any Indian reservation, you will have different layers of sovereignty, different layers of laws, depending on the subject matter. So if you're looking, let's say, at the Kawa Indian Reservation, you will not only have the Colville Tribal Law and Order Code, you will have the federal laws and the state laws that may apply if there's some fee property or if there's a non-Indian involved. So just to give you a little bit of a background, you can see this is one of our tribes, sister tribes, the Confederated Tribes of the Umatilla Indian Reservation. And this is just to graphically show you the different types of land status. On today's reservation, we have tribal trust property, we have tribal fee property, we have non-Indian fee. You can see by the blue and the gold that this is a very checkerboarded pattern. Indian reservations, after we reserved those lands to ourselves, the Dawes and Allotment Act happened, opening up more land for non-Indians to come and settle within the Indian reservation. This causes extreme jurisdictional difficulty, and as you've seen in the last slide, there's these different layers that cause it to be difficult for transportation planning. If you're a civil engineer or a transportation planner or environmental planner, you're going to have to deal with these different layers of jurisdiction. This is a good example of how many of the reservations' land has different tenure patterns, if you will. In federal Indian law or in law school, we talk about bundle of sticks. Trust property is a restricted land status where the federal government holds title to that land. We hold this land in trust for the Spokane Tribe of Indians or for Margot Hill Spokane Tribal member. If it's fee, that means it's fee simple absolute. You have the full bundle of sticks. There's no encumbrances. You can sell it. You can lease it. You can, rent it out. Do whatever. You grant a right of way, and all those things matter for tribal transportation. We have a very complex, difficult issues when it comes to right of ways through the Indian reservation. As you can see on this slide, you have Highway 84 going through the middle of the reservation. That could be a state highway. There are Supreme Court cases deciding the jurisdiction for state highways going through an Indian reservation. It's a very complicated rule of law. To give you another perspective, if you're thinking about jurisdictional issues and tribal nations' relationships with states and local agencies, you look at the land ownership status, you consider the rights of way, you think about the liability, maybe there's enforcement. It depends on the type of road users. Are they tribal? Are they non-tribal? There are issues with civil regulatory jurisdiction, civil adjudicatory jurisdiction, and criminal jurisdiction. And all of these different levels will dictate the outcomes. And tribes often have intergovernmental working relationships with their local counties and their states. Maybe it's an intergovernmental cooperative agreement. So there's potential for regulatory, administrative, and you need judicial clarity on some of these issues. A lot of our tribal governments work with local law enforcement, and so we have cross-deputization agreements. And then also that we have MOUs and MOAs. We've done a series of research projects with tribal communities across the state and region, and there's a lot of tribes that have MOUs or MOAs for emergency medical services, for fire services. So it just depends on which tribe you're working with. Every tribe is going to be different. I'm going to speak in generalities, but every tribe has their own unique law and order code. Every tribe has their own jurisdictional history and their reservation establishment. So it really behooves you to understand a little bit of a tribe's history and their history with the federal government. Every single tribe is different. I'm speaking a little bit in generalities today, but I want you to know that it's important for you as planners to understand a little bit of history in federal Indian law for any tribes that you work with. And of course, every tribe will have its own research protocol. And I could talk a little bit more about that later, but all tribes, again, have different structures as far as their tribal government and how they want you to proceed when you do research with their tribe. Why does this matter? Why are we talking about federal Indian law? I can tell you this matters right up to the United States Supreme Court. Mobility matters. Just last year, the United States Supreme Court decided the Washington Department of Licensing versus Cougar Den case. And it was based on facts from an 1855 treaty. It's just an amazing story. The Yakama Nation negotiated their right to travel. So they have a right to travel provision in their treaty that they negotiated, their Yakama chiefs negotiated with the Yakama government. And it had to do with whether the Yakama tribal entity was required to pay a fuel tax assessment. The Yakama Nation, again, is a sovereign nation that ceded land in exchange for healthcare, education, this trust relationship with the federal government. And there are a few other tribes that have this right to mobility clause in their treaty. In states like Idaho or Montana, we have the Nez Perce and the Salish Kootenai tribe in Montana. This is not a minor issue. Millions of acres were ceded to the United States government in the Treaty of 1855, and the Yakama Nation specifically negotiated their right to travel. So I encourage you to take a little bit of time and understand federal Indian law. Again, I teach this over 3 months, and these are very complicated jurisdictional issues, but there's recent cases out of Oklahoma, the Grit decision, that very complicated. Here in Washington, we have the Hearst decision. So there's a lot of issues that are dealing with tribal communities, whether it's water law, whether it's planning or transportation. Here, the Yakama Nation specifically recognized their right to mobility, their ability to take their goods and trade. They traded clear to the West Coast, their shells to trade their elk meat, their camas, their bitterroot, and then their salmon clear to the Montanas for buffalo meat. So our tribal culture still is very important when we're talking about the right to mobility and accessibility. Here at Eastern Washington University, we have an undergraduate program as well as a master's in urban and regional planning. We do a lot of applied projects. One of our research arms is CIRCOM, and we look at mobility of tribal communities, small urban rural tribal communities. We look at the 9 western states. Here you can see that we've listed out each of the reservations, really looking at American Indian reservations and what their transportation mobility needs are, and namely accessibility. What do we have access to as far as tribal communities? We looked at, these are the federally recognized American Indian reservations and U.S. highways within the CIRCOM study area. So we've worked with these tribal communities on a local level and are working across these 9 states. Some of the key measures of mobility, accessibility, and isolation among tribal communities. We mapped out reservations, reservation area, when you're looking at traveling to metropolitan areas, how many miles is that? How many minutes of that? We looked at U.S. interstate on-ramps, and we also looked at Walmarts. That might sound silly, but a lot of tribal communities depend on Walmarts for fresh fruits and vegetables. Our tribal communities are in rural geographic locations that don't always have big grocery stores. So we're thinking about food deserts and access to fresh fruits and vegetables. One of our graduate students, Zach Becker, who got his master's in urban and regional planning here, is a GIS nerd, and he just spent hours and hours mapping out reservation and looking at distance for tribal communities to travel. So we looked at what are some of the distances to metropolitan areas, whether it was the Fort Belknap Indian Reservation or what is the nearest micropolitan center, smaller areas that would at least provide some of those fresh fruits and vegetables. We also looked at isolated communities, whether it's the Southern Ute Reservation, looking at its distance from a U.S. interstate highway ramp, and again, the nearest micropolitan population centers. By comparison, we have more urban located tribes. If we're looking at Cowlitz or Puyallup tribal headquarters, are located really, within 1 or 3 miles to a major metropolitan areas and populations with greater than 100,000. All of our tribal communities are different. And you see, given the variability, we see trends that were evident, distance, drive times to Walmart, shorter for those than other destinations. Only 4 of the reservations were farther than 100 miles to the nearest Walmart. And with the Goshutes reservation being the farthest. In Indian country, we not only think about our big tribes, the big tribes when we have national organizations, and our tribal leaders teach us this, that when we're talking about NCA, the National Congress of the American Indian, or local regional tribes like the tribal organizations like affiliated tribes of Northwest Indians, the big tribes look out for the little tribes. When it comes to water law negotiation, we try to work together and look out for tribes that might not have as much access. At Eastern Washington University, our urban planning program does a lot of projects in tribal communities. Our students go out in our senior capstones, they go out and do focus groups. Sometimes that means we get to the campus at 6 a.m. We're driving 3 hours out to OMAC. We're doing focus groups. We're on the right, you have the Keller Tribal Elder Center. We went out and met with our tribal elders, and we have students, a broad range of students that are right out in the tribal headquarters working with the tribal communities, really finding out what are the needs of that community. On the Caldwell Reservation, you have 1.4 million acres, a very large land base. The Yakima Nation, you have 1.2 million acres. So the needs really vary even from district to district. So our students worked hard to have a focus group question and answer sessions that really got some meaningful dialogue going. Our faculty, Professor Ning Lee and other folks also go out into the tribal communities. We work around their cultural schedules. Maybe we go to the Sunflower Festival or the Standing Arrow Powwow, or it's the Arrow Lakes Powwow in Inchalim. We work with tribal communities to see where their folks are most comfortable visiting with our students, and then we meet them at their community centers or their headquarters. I'm going to talk to you now a little more specifically about murdered missing Indigenous women. This is a deep dive that I've kind of been working on. We have thousands of Native American women that go missing, and a lot of it has to do with mobility, accessibility to safe transportation, and social equity. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about federal Indian laws, federal Indian policies, and then share with you the mobility maps and this research that we've been doing. Some of this is really tough information, so it can invoke strong emotions. So if you need to take a moment for yourself, please step away and take care of your own mental health, please. So a recent report of the Seattle Urban Indian Health reported that there were 5,712 murdered missing Indigenous women. The National Crime Information Center reports that in 2016, there were 5,712 reports of missing American Indian Alaska Native women and girls. This is the NCIC, the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The U.S. Department of Justice Missing Persons Database, NAMUS, at that same time only logged 116 cases. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention reported that murder is the third leading cause of death of Indigenous women. The rates of violence on some reservations can be up to 10 times higher than the national average. And again, this was a report from the Urban Indian Health Institute. I'm moving through these slides fairly quickly, but I will make them available. There's a lot of information, and then I want to make sure that we have some time for questions. So when we look at National Intimate Partner and Sexual Violence, a survey that was done, 4 in 5 American Indian and Alaska Native women have experienced violence in their lifetime. 56% have experienced sexual violence. 55% have experienced physical violence by an intimate partner. 48% experienced stalking. 66% experience psychological aggression by an intimate partner. 1/3 of American Indian women will be raped in their lifetimes. And we look at the data from the National Institute of Justice. When you look at data of American Indians, it's really hard to understand the data and find good data. Tribes don't always report out information. We've done a lot of research on traffic safety. So here, the National Institute of Justice looked at the actual death certificates. Indian Health Service reports these deaths and causes. So this was pretty accurate data, but they found that Native women are murdered at the rate of more than 10 times the national average on some reservations. So I mentioned I was the attorney for the Spokane tribe, and really this legal jurisdictional complicated structure that I started with in the beginning really tells you why it's so difficult. In tribal communities, we are, because of the law and the state of the law, we are dependent upon the U.S. Attorney's Office to prosecute major crimes. So tribal communities were divested of their jurisdiction to prosecute major crimes by the Major Crimes Act. So if there's a major crime like murder, rape, arson, then we're required to contact the FBI and contact the U.S. Attorney's Office to come in and prosecute those crimes. Unfortunately, during my time as a tribal attorney, for years, we tried to get perpetrators to be held responsible and held liable for the crimes they committed on the reservation: domestic violence, rape, child molestation. We worked really hard through law and order code changes, and we worked with forensic interviewing specialists like KC Family Partner Services to have interviews that would hold up in court. Nevertheless, we often got declination letters from the United States Attorney's Office. We witnessed extreme cases of rape, sodomy, violence, and the U.S. Attorney's Office declined to prosecute. There were even severe violent cases with drugs where tribal members were sliced from ear to ear, requiring 72 stitches, in which the U.S. Attorney's Office declined prosecution. We are working to hold perpetrators of domestic violence accountable. We are enacting reforms on federal crimes to help enhance jurisdiction over crimes of domestic violence, tribal protection orders, amendments to the federal assault statute. These will all significantly improve the safety of women in our tribal communities. We have 2 U.S. Congresswomen that are Native American, and we have Deborah Holland, and we have U.S. Congresswoman Sharice Davis that are U.S. Congresswomen, and they are bringing forward legislation like Savannah's Act, and they are bringing forward legislation like Invisible No More. So we are working across the country to deal with this issue of safe mobility for Indian women. We need greater tribal jurisdiction over domestic violence cases. Unfortunately, there's a case, the Oliphant case, which says that tribes do not have criminal jurisdiction over non-Indians that commit crimes within the reservation. So if you have non-Indian actors on the reservation committing rape or assault, we have to call the local sheriff. We have to call outside jurisdictions. So it makes it really hard to protect women or men from violent crime. If the perpetrator's a non-Native female assaulting a male, we have a hard time. We're forced to call the local sheriff, and it depends on our relationship with the county sheriff. Sometimes they don't show up. Our chief of police mentioned last year during the 4th of July, we had a domestic violence situation. We called the local sheriff and nobody showed up. And really, it is immoral for Indian women to be left vulnerable to violence because of their abusive spouse is a non-Indian. You know, my students, my non-Indian students will even say, but Professor Hill, if I go into the state of Idaho, if I come to the state of Oregon, I'm subject to the laws of Oregon. Well, that's not true when you go into Indian country. Tribal governments, even though they are sovereign nations, are divested of that jurisdiction, and it's kind of a paternalistic idea, and hopefully we'll get a Supreme Court fix of that someday. So I'm not going to share all the details because I want to get through to some of the mapping and the data that we looked at, but the Urban Indian Health Institute began this study, and there hasn't been great research done for urban Indian women and the violence against Native women living in urban areas. The data is a little bit different, and you as civil engineers can and transportation planners and environmental engineers, the data is different compared to who's talking. But some of our GIS folks say that there's about 55% rural small town Native Americans, and then about 45% urban Indians. So the data is different depending on which report, or if you look at that yourselves. We took a look at that and found about 45% rural and small town, and or 55% rural and small town, and 45 urban Indian. So moving through, understand that when we talk about institutional practices, we have murdered missing Indigenous women. They go missing 3 times. They go missing in life, they go missing in the media, nobody reports on it, and then we go missing in data. So how does this happen? When we look at Indigenous mobility, when we think about the history of United States government and the policies that affect how tribal people live and how we move today, it's important to understand a little bit of federal Indian history. In the 1950s, American Indians had forced relocation from urban areas. They were promoted by certain members of Congress. They were prepping Indian communities for termination. They did. The United States government didn't want to have any trust responsibility. They had, acquired our land and made the treaties, and then they wanted termination. So the termination policies really eliminated government recognition of tribes, and the sale of tribal lands after they took all the lands they could. When tribal people were relocated to urban centers, there were barriers for housing, education, employment, but there were, all of these things, but we were moved into cities because our reservation communities had the worst geography. We were pushed into mountains. But I wanted to share with you, this is a map that one of our graduate students, Zachary Becker, helped me. He made when I explained to him these federal Indian policies and how tribal people were moved. So these are a few selected American Indian reservations from 1950 to 1970. In this map, you can see where from Washington, we have American Indians in Washington, whether they were Cabo Indians or Spokane Indians, moved into California. We have Anishinaabe and different Minnesota tribal communities moved to San Francisco, Oakland, and San Jose in California. There were the Dakotas tribes, Sioux and different tribes moved to Los Angeles. Of course, with the Dakotas, we have Nakota, Dakota, and Lakota. We have Southwest tribes moved, and just think, these were completely different climates. If you have Southwestern Indians moved up into Chicago, into the Minnesotas, that is very hard on our Indian sensibilities. We were knowledgeable about our climates and our lands, and so this was very hard for us as tribal people. You have Alaskan natives that were relocated into Chicago. This is very hard for tribal members to relocate. My grandmother friends, my mom was born in Seattle. My grandparents, Peter B. Tanaska and Ida Pion Boyd, was relocated from the Spokane Indian Reservation to Seattle during the war. So my mom was born in Seattle in 1942. You have all of these tribes that, like I said, the Navajo Nation being moved into Chicago. It's very hard on our sensibilities. One tribal leader was telling me about some Alaskan natives who were moved into the city, and that when they got to the city, the BIA agent said, just let me know if you have any issues, if you need any help. And here's Alaskan natives who are so talented. They know how to live out in extreme conditions. They can skin out seals and make their homes out of the tundra and all these incredible things. And they're plopped in Seattle, Washington. And the BIA agent says, just call me. So they call him and they said, okay, I don't know where I'm at. And he said, well, what street corner are you on? And he said, I'm on Walk and Don't Walk. That might sound silly to us, but here are these folks that are being used to being out in the village and have these amazing hunting and survival skills, and they're forced to be relocated in the city. One of my Caldwell grandma friends, when they were relocated to California, she could hear a Navajo woman who, when her husband went to work, all she spoke is Navajo. And so she cried throughout the day because she was isolated from her family and from her community as part of this federal government policy. So we think about mobility, we think about accessibility for these tribal communities, their tribal cultures. We did some work with the American Indian Community Center, a nonprofit here in the city of Spokane. And we went in, we met with them, and we took a look at we identified all of the tribal members that they served here in Spokane. The city of Spokane is the major urban core from Seattle to Minnesota. So we have upwards 10, 12, 14,000 Indians in the city of Spokane. You don't see us, but we're here. We have a lot of services. We have an American Indian Community Center. We have Spokane, the Native Health Project. We have Spokane Tribal TANF. We're surrounded by 5 tribes, and we have 5 universities here in Spokane, Washington. There are a lot of people that are here in Spokane, whether it was migrating back. Maybe they were in Seattle on the west side and they were migrating back to their reservations in the Dakotas. Or in Oregon, they were migrating home. And when they're coming through Spokane, maybe they had some trouble with the law or trouble with CPS, and their kids got removed. There's a lot of kids that are put into foster homes and adopted out, and that causes a lot of issues for Indian children. In the state of Oregon, tribal people and Native Americans are adopted out and put into foster homes at 5 times the rate of any other nationality, 10 times the rate in some cases. So this is a major problem when we have cultural systems that are different from mainstream America and our children are adopted out. How do we move? Tribal people have extensive patterns of mobility. We are fully expected. This is my daughter visiting with her Sila, and my other daughter visiting with the tribal elder who beaded her buckskin dress. How do you interact with vulnerable communities? You understand their mobility patterns, their accessibility. What are your travel routes? Traveling practice routes of our parents and our grandparents. Tribal mobility is not random. We move back and forth between our reservation communities for ceremonies. We were to the cities for jobs and universities to get our education. I moved to the city so my kids could get an education. But we're constantly back on I was at the reservation till 10:30, 11 last night, working on my grandmother's house. Traditionally, we are expected to go to ceremonies and visit with our elders. We have current systems of travel, and our transportation systems are not keeping up mobility of tribal people. We've got to figure out better systems of transit to keep our women safe. If you look at a recent study in LA, looking at the mobility of women in general, women have more use of public transportation. We are more likely to live in a car-free or car-light household. We ride more public transportation. The largest barrier to transit for women in the LA region is I don't feel safe. Women have lower wages and we live in poverty. It's harder to buy a bus pass, and we can only come up with chunks of money. If we look at the safety of Indigenous women and mobility, understanding that tribal people have unique mobility patterns, that we travel from the reservation to the city. We're connected with other natives across many reservations, and often women are hitchhiking. If you look, there was a book put out by Jessica McDermott called Highway of Tears, looking at First Nations in Canada and the number of Indian women that went missing. Some of the perpetrators were serial killers, sometimes even law enforcement and judges, but these women continued to go missing. I can tell you that right here in Spokane, I was taking my son to a Greyhound to catch the bus back to the University of Washington. My kids live in Seattle and we don't have a lot of money, so they ride the Greyhound. There was a young Native woman that was stranded, and she had been left by her boyfriend's family. And so I said, what's going on? And she said, can I help you? And she said, I was trying to buy a bus ticket. My mom was on the phone with her credit card trying to buy a bus ticket. Often we don't have the same cash systems in our tribal communities. We have tribal ID, not state ID. So these transportation systems, because of our work on murdered, missing Indigenous women, they are trying to say, what are the solutions to help people travel safely? So if any runaways are needing a bus ticket home, if they go to Greyhound, now they can ask for a ticket and somebody will get that ticket paid for them. So we don't have young men and young women, young Indigenous people out on the street being subject to human trafficking. There's a large issue with human trafficking in our transportation systems, and it's all of our responsibility. A number of our tribal communities are near borders, and so I have a huge number of stories about human trafficking and tribal communities. I'm going to try to move through these. So these are some violence against women slides, but understand that half of Indigenous women experience DV. Many DV perpetrators are non-native and we don't have jurisdiction. 67% of child abuse cases are thrown out by the U.S. Attorney's Office. These are Indigenous women that are victims of domestic violence, police brutality, trafficking, and I don't mean to talk bad about cops. I appreciate law enforcement. I work with cops all day long. These are just some of the reports that come up, and I'm just going to move through some of these. Understand the geography. These are happening in states across the United States, New Mexico, Washington. My kids live in Seattle, one of the highest rate cities, Seattle, 45 murdered, missing Indigenous cases. I can tell you right now, we are working with the Washington State Patrol. They had funding to hire a Western Washington tribal liaison to work on murdered, missing Indigenous women, and an Eastern Washington. That funding was cut because of COVID. And recently, the Spokane tribe, I worked with my tribe based on the research that we did here at CIRCOM. They took that research and sent a letter to the other tribes. They sent a letter to the governor. The affiliated tribes of Northwest Indians, 57 tribes sent a resolution to state representatives, and we got that position reinstated. Spokane, Washington is one of the highest rates of women and young men that go missing. And so we're trying to make sure that we get the information where it needs to be. So they're hiring the Eastern Washington State Tribal Liaison. So let me just tell you a little bit about Idella. Again, she was a Northern Arapaho. As a young girl, her grandparents found her aunt in a house in their home in Seattle. Her aunt was deceased. They had been over at Yakima at a powwow. Her grandma got a bad feeling, and so they went home. There was no investigation on her aunt that died in Seattle. She went on to study at the University of Montana. Again, she got a call, and her sister had been murdered on the Wind River Reservation. Her family drove to Wind River. Upon arriving, there was no police tape. There was no big investigation. She found out that her sister's body was left outside a hospital door, and that just the nurse happened to look out and find the body. So Idella herself was in a violent dating relationship, and the police told her the state laws here in Montana do not protect you. You should move somewhere else. And then she came to Spokane, Washington. So some of the risk factors, when you're thinking about transportation, mobility, accessibility, the risk factors include structural discrimination. This is a model that I created to explain some of the factors when you're doing research in tribal communities. Maybe it's structural issues like legal process and jurisdiction, public policies, institutional practices, culture representations. In the media, we see pictures of Pocahontas with a short skirt and off the shoulder. We do not dress like that. We are covered from our necks to our ankles, to our wrists. And I'm going to quit after this slide so you guys can ask some questions. But we don't have banks on our reservations, so we're stuck. We're forced to use cash systems. Because of the land tenure, nobody rushes out to build banks. Nobody rushes out to build houses. You have individual issues of poverty, stable housing, reliable transportation, education. We have a hard time getting teachers out to the reservation in some cases. Individuals are exposed to violence, sexual assault, addiction, sexual and physical abuse. This is a problem for mobility safety. I can tell you 2 days ago, we were driving from the reservation and we picked up a young or a middle-aged Native woman. She was Alaskan Native that had been at her son's house, and she was hitchhiking to Spokane to go to a woman's shelter. So in tribal communities, we have disparate opportunities. The geography, when the settlers moved in, they wanted the best lands and they kind of pushed us out to poor geographic areas. Lack of employment, poverty, violence, addiction, loss of land and culture. And all of these factors lead to murdered, missing Indigenous women. And these are the risk factors. So we try to look at the federal Indian laws. We try to map these issues to try to tell the story. And you can do that as planners, working with tribal communities to find solutions. So let me stop there.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Margot. We're going to do some Q&A with our audience now.
Yeah, thank you, Margot, for that. Oh, go ahead, Jennifer.
Well, I was just going to say, just a reminder, if you want to ask a question, use the question panel in GoToMeeting, type it in, and we will convey it. So.
Yeah, so I'll go first. Thank you for that powerful presentation. So one of the questions is where would be a good place to point people for resources that they can start learning? Because I think, I mean, even my own ignorance on sort of the level of sort of it sounds even more complicated than working with railroads is where my most complicated things have gone. So how about where would be some resources for folks to sort of understand the tribal structure, laws, and things like that?
Okay, that's a great question. So we're fortunate here in the Pacific Northwest to have affiliated tribes of Northwest Indians. AT&I, they recently updated their website. They have committees organized by every topic, by environment, by education, by taxes, by transportation. They have some of the top leaders in the entire United States represented and working at AT&I. All of the 57 tribes come together. We have a powerful committee on climate change. We have annual conferences. Last year, I went with one of my graduate students. As I mentioned, we have a master's in urban regional planning here at EW. I did a climate change camp in Montana on Flathead Lake, just supporting her research. But that was through Affiliated Tribes of Northwest Indians. Currently, the president of the National Congress of American Indians is Fawn Sharp, a Quinault tribal member. So National Congress of American Indians is another powerful resource. And then the last one I would mention is NARF, Native American Rights Fund. They are incredible legal advocates for Natives across the United States. And then another reference, sorry, I get excited, Turtle Talk. Matthew Fletcher puts out an amazing website that gives you all the updates of Indian law, of articles written, and they're just a wealth of knowledge. So AT&I, Affiliated Tribes Northwest Indians, NCA, National Congress American Indians, NARF, and Turtle Talk.
All right.
The last one's Turtle Talk.
Turtle Talk. It's a website that gives you up-to-date legal cases, scholarly articles. It's amazing. Maybe University of Minnesota, Matthew Fletcher is the author.
Okay, thank you.
A question, what is the digital access situation like for Washington tribal communities? So are smartphones common? The questioner is trying to get a picture of sort of the travel experience and maybe how digital and smartphone access might be assisting or not in mobility.
So that's a great question. Infrastructure is still very much a challenge for many tribal communities. Many tribal communities still have almost third world infrastructure systems. If you look at some of the remote reservations down in the Southwest, if it's Navajo Nation, COVID has presented some challenges because in some of our tribal communities, we don't have running water. Here in the Northwest, we have both rural and urban tribes. So it depends on each tribe, but I can tell you this digital divide has really reared its ugly face during COVID. A lot of our Indian children have not had access to the internet. When our teachers, like many of us, have gone online here at the Eastern Washington University or in our tribal schools, they don't have access to Zoom because they don't have that basic infrastructure. Tribes have been diligently working, our tribal leaders. One of our graduates from EWU works at Department of Commerce, and he's been reaching out, trying to help tribes have short-term and long-term solutions for internet and infrastructure. So it just really depends. At Tulalip, we had State Representative John McCoy that worked, and they developed a system in which they worked with the University of Washington. They did an assessment with the engineering department. They went out and got grants and built the infrastructure to have broadband and to have internet. The Spokane tribe has been working really hard, not only to have hotspots. So we have some of that infrastructure at our tribal administrative building, our powwow grounds, our school systems, but it's still not in everybody's home. And that digital divide is hard on Indian country. So we are working across the region, both on the reservation and in the urban core. Urban community centers like the American Indian Community Center and the the Native Project gave out Chromebooks to little Native kids here in Spokane, trying to provide some of that access when we had that digital divide. So we're working hard both in the urban center and the reservation communities.
Sorry, I muted myself. We have a flurry of questions here. I'm going to ask one, but I'm also going to ask Teresa. A couple people have put links to some of the resources that you've mentioned, and they've put them in the question box. And I'm going to ask Teresa if she can copy those into chat to share with our whole audience.
Sure thing.
Thank you. So we have a question here about the importance of tribal representation on, the particular question is about the Spokane Regional Transportation Council. And maybe just speaking, I mean, that's a specific example, but maybe even to broaden it out, how are tribes represented on these traditional sort of transportation agencies that are operating near and perhaps overlapping with reservations?
Representation is a big issue on a national scene. Like I said, we have U.S. Congresswoman Deborah Haaland and Sharice Davids. Across the states, we have a number of Native folks running for office, so get out the vote. In Washington State, we have Raquel Montel Lewis, Washington State Supreme Court. It's important to have your worldview and perspective represented on the bench, as well as Spokane Regional Transportation Council. That's a very specific question and a really politically charged question. And I will also mention that Karina Miller from the Warm Springs Nation is running for office there in Oregon. Here in the Spokane region, tribes are fighting to get a seat at the table. We have major enterprises that are located in our ceded territories off the reservation. Let's say my reservation is 48 miles northwest of Spokane. Our homelands were here on the banks of the Spokane River. The city of Spokane is named after Spokane, our people, and this was our homelands. We were moved by the United States government, but we still have enterprises in Airway Heights. The Kalispel tribes also have an enterprise. They're operating here in our ceded territories, Northern Quest. So tribes who have major enterprises should have a seat at the table when we are operating off our smaller reservation boundaries. We are in the city. It's been controversial. There's been county commissioners who said, we don't want no Indians. We don't want any tribal representation. The Spokane tribe has brought this issue right to our legislature. We are good partners. We invest hundreds of thousands of dollars for Spokane Boulevard, for our right-of-ways, whether they're by our casinos or other. The Kalispel tribe has the Camas Path Institute that provides drug and alcohol counseling, provides social services. And the Spokane tribe also has buildings here in Spokane Tribal TANF, where they provide temporary assistance to needy families. And so there's these major operations, and tribe are sovereign governments, and they should have a seat at the table. So there's been some controversy. I know there was some sites put up by Spokane Planner talking about county commissioners, and I don't ever talk about the race card or colonization, but when you say we don't want tribes to have a seat at the table, I'm not sure what else you would call it when we have major enterprises running right through city major highways. And I would just say we are great partners. We pay taxes, we pay for law enforcement, we pay for water and sewer. We have MOAs with Airway Heights, with different organizations, different counties.
Great.
Great.
Go ahead, Chris. You have one
Question. Public meetings sometimes begin by recognizing the lands they're taking place on that belong to Indigenous people. How do you feel about such statements at the onset of public meetings?
I very much believe in land acknowledgement. I make that my practice. If I'm presenting for ACSP in South Carolina, I found out whose tribe traditionally inhabited that territory. It's a recognition, and that every university, every organization should practice that. When we know better, we do better. It's acknowledging, colonization or inequities, the treatment of Native Americans, that we were dispossessed of our lands. It's honoring and recognizing. Often we are fighting for the environment. The Spokane tribe has higher water quality standards than anybody. Tribes, when they're advocating for clean water, that's good for everybody. So when you recognize the local Indigenous people, you are honoring the stewards of the earth who are working to have things like clean water. So I very much believe in land acknowledgement, and I support people's efforts in that.
Great. So I'm going to try to, since we're almost out of time, I'm going to try to combine a couple questions here. And in terms of transportation priorities, you talked a lot about mobility between tribal lands and to urban areas, et cetera. And so if you were trying to discuss some of the transportation infrastructure priorities, would it be sort of better connections or transit service connecting these destinations, or within tribal lands, what might some of the transportation infrastructure priorities be?
Okay, so tribes are very, we have come a long way. We have transit systems. On my reservation, we have the Moccasin Express. We have really evolved to have nice transit systems. Currently here at CIRCOM, we're doing focus group across the 9 states, working with 71 tribes. Well, those tribes that have transit. My sister lives, in Welpinit, and she's in a wheelchair. She is very dependent upon the Moccasin Express to get to her medical appointments, to get to the local grocery store, Walmart, to get fresh fruits and vegetables. So tribal communities have come a long way. If you're looking at Nez Perce or Coeur d'Alene tribe, or different tribes have very nice transit systems. Muckleshoot tribe, they're connected to non-native transit systems like rural resources. And here in Spokane, we're connected to the Spokane Transit Authority. So we can move from our reservation community to Airway Heights. And it goes clear down to the bus stop, the bus station, Spokane Transit Authority. So we're very interconnected, and tribes are working smarter to provide and meet the transportation needs of their tribal members and rural tribal communities.
Great, thank you. I think that wraps up the time we have for the seminar. So I want to thank Margot Hill for that great presentation, and let you know, I guess, let me share my screen.
And can I just say that please take a look at Indian Country. We hire transportation planners, environmental planners. We need civil engineers. So look at the local tribes when you're looking for jobs.
I guess I'm having screen troubles again. So just know that our future events, you can find it on the Trek website, and follow us on social media. And we'll see you next week. Thank you.
Thank you.
Teresa, you'll stop the...
Yeah, I'm trying to stop it. It's doing something weird, but everyone's free to go while I figure out how to end this webinar.